Good evening. I'm sure you guys are all pretty well versed in the current controversy over the national anthem. I know my Facebook feed is inundated with memes explaining that those who kneel in front of the national anthem are not protesting the flag, just as Rosa Parks wasn't protesting buses and people on hunger strikes aren't protesting food. Yet still some people believe it's unpatriotic to not stand for the national anthem. Some have even suggested those football players should be fired from their jobs. Yet the NFL doesn't have any rule requiring people to stand, just as the US Criminal Code doesn't as well. But the US Flag Code does say that when the national anthem is sung, those in military uniform should do the military salute, and everybody else should stand at attention with their hand over their heart. That should implies a duty, a responsibility. It's all voluntary. You don't have to do it. What I want to talk about today is how we learn what it means to be patriotic and how we learn how to deal when other people express themselves differently than we would like them to. To answer that question, we got to start with the history of Chicago. This is the Chicago flag. It represents the geography of Chicago, and that the top white stripe is the north side, the middle white stripe is the west side, and the bottom white stripe is the south side. Here in Chicago, we don't need an east side because you'd be in Lake Michigan and be all wet. The flag does represent water, though, because the top blue stripe is the north branch of the Chicago River, and the bottom blue stripe is the south branch of the Chicago River. It's not clicking. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so the flag doesn't just represent the geography of Chicago, it also represents the history. Through the stars, in terms of each one, represents a certain anecdote in our history. The first one is Fort Dearborn Massacre of 1812. The second one is the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The third one is the Columbian Exposition of 1893. And the last one is the Century of Progress, 1933-1934. So the first two stars are about Chicago's resilience, how we respond in the face of tragedy. The second two are about the two World's Fairs, and they represent what Chicago can do when we come together as a community. The 1893 World's Fair was supposed to celebrate the 400 years of what we have done on our shore since Columbus arrived. That was its initial plan, but had a secondary goal as well. The secondary goal was to put Chicago on the map. Literally, before that time, Milwaukee would be on international maps, but Chicago would not. They wanted to show that we were a world-class city, both to other Americans and to people abroad. The way Chicago attempted to accomplish both of those goals was through the creation of what people call the White City. It was a gleaming white neoclassical city with electric lights and running water, something people hadn't seen before. By all accounts, the fair was a great success. 27 million people came to the fair. When people talk about it, they talk about all the things the fair introduced the world to, because it introduced Ferris wheels, Cracker Jacks, Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, fluorescent lights, and stamps, commemorative stamps and coins. But when people talk about the fair, they generally miss one of the most important and enduring firsts that the fair had, the Pledge of Allegiance. Although the fair was in 1893, 401 years after Columbus arrived, the building dedication happened October 19th, 1892, on what President Harrison declared as Columbus Day. At this point in our history, we used to celebrate Columbus Day every 100 years, not every year. At that point, there was a pretty famous children's magazine called The Youth's Companion that was dedicated to piety and virtue. They had a pet project where they were trying to get every school in the nation to fly an American flag. At that point, most schools didn't have a flag, let alone fly it. So when President Harrison announced that we were going to have this Columbus Day celebration and that school children should be involved in the process, the magazine got one of their employees, Francis Bellamy, to get himself elected to the chair of the committee of the Association of School Superintendents so that he could have a say in what would happen on that day. What he did was he wrote the pledge, and he planned a program that highlighted school children across the nation saluting the flag and doing the pledge. The pledge that Bellamy invented was, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. It sounds pretty familiar to you, I imagine, with a little bit of slight distinction. The other thing that Bellamy did was he identified what he wanted for the salute. He wanted people to look towards the flag with their hand up and their palm down, which explains the slide you saw just now. It was a big success. People got very excited about this idea of people pledging the flag, and schools across the nation started doing it. But they didn't always do Bellamy's salute. In New York City, they gave schools 5 different choices of different pledges. In San Francisco, every school did something different. In fact, one school's pledge was, "We turn to the flag as a sunflower turns to the sun, pledging our heads and our hearts to one country, one language, one flag." This went on for a while, and while people were excited about school children doing the pledge, they were upset that different people were doing different pledges and there wasn't that unity. So in 1923, a group of citizens got together to have a flag convention where they wanted to figure out what the flag etiquette should be so we would all do it all the same. They took Bellamy's pledge, but they changed it slightly. They modified the flag in terms of which flag we were pledging to. As a nation of immigrants, some people were concerned that when people pledge the flag, they could be pledging to any flag. So they added, "of the United States of America." They also continued using Bellamy's salute. Schools across the nation started doing it. People really thought it was a great thing. One evidence that it was really part of our American fabric is during World War II, in 1941, 4th of July, President Roosevelt had one of his fireside chats over the radio. And he ended his talk by saying, when we do our great pledge, we should also make sure that we are believing and adding in pledging our work, our will, and our willingness to die for the flag if need be. And then he ended the chat by having Chief Justice Harlan Stone lead the entire nation in Bellamy's pledge. Because of that, a year later, Congress decided it was time for us to actually codify the flag rules and etiquette. And so they actually made a flag code. Again, they used Bellamy's pledge as it was revised in 1923, and they kept Bellamy's salute. 6 months later, they had to revise it because they realized that Bellamy's salute was a little too close to the Nazi salute, so they changed it to the hand over the heart that we're all more familiar with. As soon as the pledge was codified into law, people started being concerned about this question of whether or not it was voluntary or not. And court cases sprouted up. The Supreme Court made it very clear that the pledge was voluntary. We could not require anybody to salute the flag, let alone pledge it. In the 50s, while we were a little bit concerned about the communist threat, Congress decided to change the pledge again. This is when we got the "under God" phrase into the pledge. And again, people were concerned about what this would mean and whether or not it was constitutional or not, since the Constitution says that we're not allowed to have oaths or tests of religion for public office or public trust. But the Supreme Court decided that since the pledge is voluntary, it wasn't a problem for the Constitution. And so we've had the pledge that we have as we move forward. States across the nation decided to make doing the pledge required in all public schools. Wisconsin even required it in private schools. And while they couldn't require that any individual student recite the pledge, they could require that schools recite it, giving students the opportunity that they could recite it as well. Today, if you ask young people about the Pledge of Allegiance, you get all sorts of different responses. Some will tell you, "We didn't do it." Others will say, "We did it, but they didn't really explain it to us." While others will say, "They blare it over the loudspeaker, and you can add your voice to it or not as you choose." And this is where I start to get worried about the pledge. Because the Pledge of Allegiance is a speech act, which means we're doing something with words, akin to promising, threatening, arguing, naming, vetoing. And speech act theory makes it very clear that they have rules around these different speech acts. Rules about who can do it, how to do it correctly, and what it means to abuse it. One of the most important rules for most speech acts are that you have to mean it. One evidence of that, I think, really makes it very clear how that works in terms of the pledge, is that we have separate rules for people in uniform and people not in uniform when it comes to the pledge. uniform, when the pledge is spoken, are supposed to give the military salute, but they're supposed to stay silent. They're not supposed to say the pledge. Why would that be? Well, I believe it's because once you put on that uniform, you've already pledged your life to the flag. You cannot choose not to at this point. And since you can't choose not to say the pledge, you also are inappropriate for you to actually say the pledge. This voluntary aspect's a big part of it. Second thing I think is important to think about when we think about the notion of the pledge as a speech act is that it's a pledge, not an oath. When we say an oath, we swear to somebody else, like God. When we pledge, we're pledging to ourselves. Done correctly, you're speaking to yourself. You're telling yourself what you believe the flag means. And you're saying what your commitment is to that flag. To me, this really is reminiscent of James Carey, a communication scholar, who talks about the idea that American communication scholars are too interested in the transmission point of communication, moving ideas from one point to another, and they forget about the ritual aspect of communication. The ritual aspect is when we're not solely concerned about that transmission piece, but we're interested in what the communication does for culture on some other level. When I explain it to my students, I usually use the example of the Passover Seder, where we retell the story of the Jews leaving Egypt, moving from slavery to freedom. The way you're supposed to tell the story is you're supposed to be as though the people at the table, they themselves are moving from slavery to freedom. Now, I've participated in this tradition for over 40 years. And most of the time, the people at the table have also been part of this tradition year after year after year. So we're not transmitting information when we tell the story. We're not even reminding each other about the information. Instead, we're enacting what it means to be Jewish. And we are remembering why it's important. The whole idea that people across the world are doing the same thing at the same time. And they've been doing it for centuries. And if we do it correctly, it'll continue to be done centuries to come. And so that reminds us how important it is to spread that knowledge to the next generation. To me, the Pledge of Allegiance does something similar for the American community. When we say the pledge, we are renewing the vows that the American colonists made when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence ends with the phrase, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." This is why, when I hear about young people saying the pledge and not meaning it or not even understanding it, it seems to me that we are making the pledge into conformity instead of liberty. And when I hear about the loudspeaker blaring it for people to just sort of listen to, it seems like we're teaching passivity instead of activity. When you look at the fact that 59.7% of eligible voters voted in the last presidential election, we can see that a large number of citizens are not doing the smallest thing that they're required to do as citizens and being active. So today, I am not advocating getting rid of the pledge. I'm advocating making it meaningful because I think it's important. I think it's a point where we can come together and all agree. If you think back to last year's conventions, both the Republican and the Democratic convention opened with the Pledge of Allegiance. And people at both of those conventions quoted the pledge in their speech. Current Vice President Mike Pence quoted it to the Republicans. And Senator Cory Booker, in his keynote address, quoted it to the Democrats. And sitting President Barack Obama, he quoted it as well. So when I think about the national anthem, and I think about NFL players kneeling, to me, I think it's a clear sign that they are breaking the code, and that we're supposed to recognize they're doing so for peaceful protest. And it makes so much sense to me within the confines of a football game. Because think about when you take a knee in football. When you receive a kickoff in the end zone, you take a knee to clearly explain that you are not going to fight for yardage. You're going to accept the placement of the ball on the designated yard line. And at the end of the game, if you want to let the clock just run down, you take a knee to say that you are not going to fight for yardage or points. You're just going to wait till the game ends. So when you see someone take a knee during the national anthem, I think you should think about what they're trying to say and ask questions instead of offer ire. Thank you.